welcome to the show.
Thanks, great to be here.
You are considered by many to be the leading expert on sentencing policy and the criminal justice system in America. This book, The Meaning of Life, specifically tackles abolishing life sentences. Big question is why?
Well, two reasons mainly. As we have a movement to end mass incarceration now, which is very encouraging, in far too many cases, I think people believe if we just had some more drug treatment programs, that would take care of the problem. The problem is much deeper than that. In terms of sentencing, 1 of every 7 people in American prisons today is serving a life sentence, 206,000 people. So we can't end mass incarceration unless we do something about excessive sentences.
Right.
It's also a public safety problem, and life sentences actually are counterproductive for public safety. The one thing we know about involvement in crime is that people age out of crime. Mid-teen years, late-teen years, early 20s, that's a high-risk time. Crime rates go up in that age group, but they rapidly come down. So by the late 20s, 30s, 40s, certainly 50s and 60s, the risk of involvement for criminal activity is much diminished. So if we have people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, we're not preventing very much crime while they're in prison, but we're spending enormous resources to do so.
But now, some people... I agree with you on this book, but I mean, there's obviously people who disagree and say to you, but shouldn't somebody spend life in jail if they have taken somebody else's life, for instance? Mm-hmm. What would your argument be to counter that?
People have to be accountable for their crimes, whether it's taking a life, whether it's shoplifting, anything in between that. But the scale of what should take place is very different in the United States. We are far more punitive than comparable nations. If you look in Western Europe, it's very unusual for anybody to spend more than 20 years in prison, either by law or in practice. And they say for the most serious crimes, you'll get 20 years. For the less serious crimes, it may be 10 or 15, and so on.
Right.
But we have a very different scale, with the death penalty at the top of the scale, life without parole at the top of the scale. So it exerts pressure on crimes across the board. That's part of the reason we have mass incarceration. If you steal a car in the United States, you're going to spend more time in prison than if you did that in England or Italy or many other countries.
Right, but when you're trying to convince people of this idea, a lot of the time it seems like the arguments are framed in a way that benefits someone who's committed a crime. You know, someone will say, I understand this, Mark, but why should we reward somebody for committing a crime? Should they not be punished as much as possible? How would you frame a benefit to a citizen who has not committed a crime? Why would it benefit them to not have people spend as much time in prison?
Well, you know, if we care about public safety, we have finite resources. We have a certain budget at the federal, state, and local level. How do we want to spend that budget? Now, normally it costs about $30,000 a year to keep someone in prison. When people are aging, it can be $60,000 more than that. So we have to think, do we want to spend money on aging people in prison? Sometimes they're in wheelchairs, incapacitated. When we have a group of 14, 15, 16-year-olds coming up every year, if we could do something in preventing them from getting into high-risk activities,
right,
we'd have a much better impact on crime. So we have to think about what the balance is. The balance we've developed in the last 40 years is all about incarceration, forgetting about prevention and treatment.
We recently saw a story that has garnered a lot of attention, the case of Santoya Brown.
Sure.
And she was granted clemency by the governor, who's outgoing. And this was a story of a young girl who was picked up by a man as basically a sex slave.
Right.
And, you know, she fought for her life and says in her defense she killed the man. And now this became the big story. And people said she had to spend the rest of her life in prison as a child.
Right.
And after she was granted clemency, the question then became, is this something that America needs to do for everybody? Mm-hmm. Do you think America is moving in the right direction?
Slowly but surely we're moving in that direction. You know, we saw in Congress passing legislation, the First Step Back, just a few weeks ago. It's not going to end mass incarceration, but it reduces the use of mandatory sentencing for drug crimes. It'll have some modest effect on reducing the number of people in prison overall. So it's a beginning. It's a first step, as it's called. We need a second, third, and fourth step if we
right,
really want to have an impact. But after 4 decades of rising prison populations, we're beginning to see some reduction, a little more rational development of policy now.
And then what do you think the U.S. does for those people who are let out and then repeat a crime?
Well, we have to look at what we're doing to help people refrain from getting involved in crime. You know, the movement for reentry, people coming home from prison, liberals and conservatives alike have embraced this idea that people coming out of prison should have the skills, should have the resources, the support they need so they don't have to go back in prison. But
Right.
the resources we're putting into it is just a fraction of what's needed. You have to remember when people go to prison at the age of 30, far too many cases. It's been a very dysfunctional lifestyle they've had, family, community problems, and the like. That doesn't change overnight. So we have to be much more serious about reducing time people spend in prison and focusing on that reentry back to the community.
Your book is amazing. Thank you so much for being on the
Thanks
show.
so much for having me.
Pleasure having you. The Meaning of Life, a really fantastic read, is available now. Marc Mauer, everybody.